The German Shepherd hit the end of his chain so hard the steel anchor bolt tore halfway out of the concrete wall. 3 handlers went down. One broke 2 fingers. Another caught a gash across the forearm that soaked through his sleeve before he reached the hallway. The third simply let go and pressed himself flat against the door, breathing hard, refusing to look anyone in the eye. The dog, 110 pounds of decorated combat veteran, had not stopped screaming since they'd wheeled him through the bay doors of Hargrove Memorial Hospital. Every physician in the emergency wing had stepped back. Some had already left. And then the department supervisor, a man named Garrett Pollock, turned to the newest, quietest nurse on the floor, smiled the way men smile when they already know the answer, and said, "Why don't you give it a shot, Carter?" Her name was Nora Carter. Nobody in that building knew what she'd once been. The dog was about to remember. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week I bring you stories that will make your jaw drop, your heart race, and your faith in quiet strength completely restored. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back inside that hospital, because what happens in the next 2 hours will change everything. Hargrove Memorial Hospital sat at the edge of Dalton Springs, Wyoming, in the kind of town that never made national news and preferred it that way. The building itself was a hybrid, half civilian trauma center, half contract care facility for active duty and veteran military personnel rotating through the northern region. It smelled the way all hospitals did, like bleach, and something underneath the bleach that nobody wanted to identify. And on most days it operated with the low hum of controlled routine. This was not most days. The chaos had started at 6:14 in the morning when a white Department of Defense transport van pulled around to the service entrance and 3 uniformed Army handlers stepped out with a Belgian Malinois named Recon, technically designated K9 110, 13 years old, decorated, retired from active service 8 weeks ago after a knee surgery overseas and a subsequent behavioral assessment that had flagged him as high reactivity, non-placement recommended. The handlers had not read that assessment closely enough, or they had read it and believed it applied to other people. Within 40 seconds of entering the intake area, Recon had gone sideways. The first handler, a young sergeant named Dills, tried the standard verbal commands. Recon didn't respond to commands anymore. He responded to the environment, to the antiseptic smell, the glare of overhead fluorescence, the echo of hard floors, the unfamiliar faces in unfamiliar clothes. His entire nervous system had spent over a decade tuned to a specific frequency, and civilian hospitals played something entirely different, something his brain translated as danger. By the time Nora Carter arrived for her shift, one handler was in triage getting his hand wrapped. The intake corridor had been cleared of all non-essential personnel, and Garrett Pollock was standing in the middle of it with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who found other people's problems mildly entertaining. Pollock was the emergency department's senior floor supervisor. He had worked at Hargrove Memorial for 11 years, long enough to believe the place would fall apart without him, long enough to stop second-guessing himself, long enough to develop the particular cruelty of someone who had never been seriously challenged. He was not a doctor. He was not a nurse. He held an administrative credential and a personality that filled whatever space it entered, and he had opinions about everything, including who deserved to be in this building and who did not. Nora had been here 6 weeks. She had requested the position herself, transferred from a trauma unit down in Casper with no fanfare, and a reference letter that described her as technically excellent, interpersonally reserved, occasionally difficult to read. She was 38 years old and looked like someone who had stopped performing cheerfulness at some point and never started again. She kept her dark blonde hair in a tight braid, wore the same style of sturdy, non-slip shoes every day, and had not once in 6 weeks engaged in the group lunches or the hallway gossip or the birthday cake someone always brought on Thursdays. People had tried to figure her out the way people try to figure out anyone who doesn't volunteer information. They'd gotten almost nothing. She'd worked somewhere remote before Casper. She lived alone. She did not talk about family. She did not talk about what she'd done before nursing. She was good at her job in the way that made other people feel slightly embarrassed about how good they were at theirs. Efficient, fast, precise, almost inhumanly calm during the bad cases. Pollock had decided in the second week that her calmness was arrogance, I was the kind of man who needed an explanation for anything he couldn't immediately categorize. And when the explanation he reached for made someone else smaller, that was an added benefit. She'd come in through the side entrance at 6:40, signed in, and was heading to the medication station when she heard it. The specific sound of a large dog in full panic, and underneath it, male voices pushing too hard, pitching commands that were landing wrong. She stopped walking. Pollock was already watching the door to the intake corridor with a smirk forming at the corner of his mouth. Two other nurses stood nearby. Priya Okafor, who'd been here 4 years and was one of the few people who talked to Nora without an agenda, and a younger one named Tess who hadn't learned yet how to look neutral when she was nervous. "Military dog," Priya said quietly, leaning toward Nora. "They brought him in for a post-op follow-up. Knee reconstruction, I think. But he's been reactive since intake. 3 handlers can't get him to calm down enough for a basic examination." "Dr. Fenwick tried," Tess added. She was talking fast. "He lasted about 40 seconds before the dog lunged. He's not injured, but It was a lot." From behind the door came a sound that wasn't quite a bark and wasn't quite a scream and was somehow both. The impact of the dog hitting something solid, the clatter of something metal falling, a man's voice saying something sharp and tight. Pollock turned then, slowly, and let his eyes find Nora. He had the timing of someone who had already scripted this. "Carter." He said it the way he said her name most mornings, slightly too flat, slightly too casual, like saying a word he found mildly funny. "You're always talking about your assessment instincts. Why don't you go show us?" It wasn't really a question. It was the kind of invitation constructed to watch someone fail. Priya shot Nora a quick look. "You don't have to." But Nora wasn't looking at Priya. She was looking at the door. "Yeah," she said. "Okay." That was it. No hesitation, no asking for clarification, no adjusting her expression to signal that she understood this was some kind of test. She just walked toward the door, and the corridor went quiet the way corridors do when people sense something is about to happen that they'll talk about later. She pushed the door open. The intake room was a medium-sized space with white walls, a padded examination table bolted to the left wall, 2 equipment trolleys, and a set of overhead lights that were about 30% too bright. The floor was sealed concrete. Sound bounced off everything. Recon was in the far corner. He had backed himself into the angle where the 2 walls met, and he was facing out, and his entire body was vibrating the way a live electrical wire vibrates. Not violently, but constantly, every muscle maintaining a tension that was one wrong movement from releasing. His eyes were tracking everything in the room simultaneously, which meant they weren't tracking anything at all, just sweeping, unable to find a place to land. The second handler, a staff sergeant named Alderman, was standing about 8 feet away from him holding a leash with slack in it, which was the right instinct, not pulling. But he was still facing the dog directly, still trying to hold eye contact, still trying to win something, and the dog knew it. Nora clocked all of this in about 4 seconds. "You can go," she said. Alderman turned. I was a big guy, mid-30s, the kind of built that came from actual work rather than a gym. He looked at her once, and then looked at her again the way people look when they've already formed an opinion, and the evidence in front of them doesn't match it. "Ma'am, with respect, this animal is classified." "I know what he is," she said. "Not hard, just settled." "You can wait outside, you're making it worse." Something shifted in Alderman's face. Not offense exactly, more like the specific discomfort of being told a true thing by someone you weren't expecting it from. He looked at the dog, looked at her, and then handed her the leash end, not even the leash itself, just the loop, and walked out without another word. The door closed. The room had 2 beings in it now. Nora didn't approach the dog. She didn't crouch down in that performing calm way that people think dogs respond to. She didn't speak. She walked to the center of the room, sat down on the floor, just sat, legs loosely crossed, back not quite straight, hands resting open on her knees. And she looked at a point on the wall about 2 feet to the left of the dog, and she waited. Recon kept his position for a full minute, maybe longer. His barking had stopped the second the other handler left. That was something, but it didn't mean the danger was gone in his brain. It meant one specific trigger had been removed. The room was still wrong. The smells were still wrong. The lights were still too bright. But there was this person, this woman, sitting on the floor like she had nowhere else to be. not looking at him, not demanding anything, not throwing commands at him like projectiles. His breathing changed at about the 90-second mark. Still elevated, but beginning to cycle lower. Nora didn't move. She could see him in her peripheral vision, which was where she kept him, not looking away entirely, because that would have been a lie, and dogs know lies, but not staring into his face either, because that was pressure. She kept herself in his sightline without making herself a point of confrontation. At some point she spoke. Very low, barely above a murmur, the kind of thing that's more about sound than content. "Hey, Recon." Just that. The dog's ears, which had been hard-pinned back since she'd entered, rotated forward about 30 degrees. She didn't push it. She waited some more. The floor was cold and hard, and she'd have a bruise on her right hip from a corner of something, but she didn't adjust her position. Another minute. Maybe two. And then Recon took a step away from the corner. He didn't come toward her yet. He moved laterally, testing the room now rather than defending from it, which was different. That was curiosity rather than fear, and that was the shift she'd been waiting for. She kept her breathing steady, kept her gaze soft, kept her body language the specific kind of non-event that meant, "I'm not here to take anything from you." His second step brought him forward. His third was directly toward her. He stopped about 3 feet away and dropped his nose toward the floor and scented the air between them. His whole face working, processing, running some complex internal calculus that she understood even if she couldn't name every component of it. She let him come to the moment himself. When he finally closed the distance and pushed his muzzle against her left hand, she let him do that too. She didn't immediately reach to pet him. She let the contact be his decision, his timing, and when she finally moved her hand, slowly, unhurried, it was to rest it gently along the side of his neck, and she felt the remaining tension there begin, millimeter by millimeter, to release. He sank down beside her. His head came to rest on her knee. The entire weight of him just let go. Outside the door, nobody spoke. Priya had her hand over her mouth. Tess had gone pale. Alderman was standing very still with his arms hanging loose at his sides and the expression of a man who was revising something significant. 2 of the hospital's emergency physicians had drifted over from the adjacent corridor without fully meaning to. And Pollock was standing in the middle of all of it looking at the small window in the intake door, and for the first time in 6 weeks, he wasn't smiling. He said, eventually, "She staged that." Priya turned to look at him. "What?" She had prior contact with the animal. She set this up to look good. He said it with conviction, the way people say things they know aren't true but need to believe. "There's no other explanation." "She's never met this dog," Alderman said. His voice was quiet. "He arrived this morning. She wasn't here." Pollock's jaw tightened. "Then she has some kind of training that wasn't disclosed in her file. That's a credentialing issue." "Garrett," Priya said his name with a flatness that made a couple of people step back. She just walked into a room by herself with a 90-pound reactive combat dog and sat on the floor, and he calmed down. "You told her to do it. Are you seriously standing here trying to turn that into a problem?" Pollock didn't answer. The examination was completed within the hour. Dr. Yael Stern, the veterinary physician on rotation, managed the post-surgical knee assessment with Nora present, crouched beside Recon the entire time with one hand on him, and the dog held still through the entire procedure. No sedation required. Stern kept making small, quiet sounds of relief and disbelief that she clearly didn't intend to be audible. By 9 a.m., the intake wing had gone back to its usual rhythm, and the story had already moved through the building staff faster than anything on the announcement board. Nora, characteristically, had said almost nothing about any of it. She'd gone to the supply station, washed her hands, checked her patient assignment list, and been heading toward the East Ward when Pollock materialized at her shoulder like something summoned. "I need to see your original application materials," he said, walking beside her. "The full packet. Specifically, any prior work with animals or military personnel." "There's nothing in my file about animals," she said. "Then I need to understand how you did that." She stopped walking, turned to look at him, not with anger, not with the exasperation he was possibly expecting, but with the specific stillness of someone who has dealt with this category of conversation enough times to have stopped finding it surprising. "I sat on the floor," she said. "I was quiet. I waited." Pollock looked at her with the expression of a man who'd received an answer that didn't satisfy him but couldn't immediately identify the flaw in it. I'll be reviewing your file this afternoon, he said. If there's anything undisclosed in your background, you'll find what's in there, she said, and walked away. She didn't look back. She went about her shift with the same focused efficiency she always brought, and if her hands weren't quite steady when she was alone in the medication room at 10:15, there was no one there to see it. What she hadn't told anyone, what she had not told anyone in Dalton Springs or Casper or the quiet apartment between the two, where she'd spent 4 months trying to remember how to sleep past 4 a.m., was that she recognized Recon. Not from a chart, not from a database. She recognized the structure of his behavior, the precise geography of his panic, the way he'd cornered himself, the specific frequency of his distress, because she had spent 22 months of her life working with dogs exactly like him, in a program that most people in this building didn't have clearance to know existed. She had been 24 years old when she enlisted. She had come in as a combat medic, done 2 overseas rotations, and at some point in the middle of her second tour, she had been pulled aside by a colonel she'd met exactly once before and offered an assignment she wasn't supposed to discuss. The assignment was at a facility in the Northwest, not overseas, domestic, attached to a classified military canine program that prepared working dogs for high-risk deployment scenarios. The dogs who arrived there were not ordinary. They were animals with significant combat exposure, significant trauma histories, significant behavioral complications that made standard military handlers unable to work with them safely. The program's job was to bring them back, not to erase what they'd been through, because that wasn't possible, but to find the space where they could still function, still work, still trust. Nora had not been assigned to the program because of any particular animal expertise. She'd been assigned because of a combination of things the colonel had listed in a way that made her feel simultaneously assessed and strange. Her injury management record, her performance under stress, her low reactivity profile, her physiological data from an extended isolation exercise that apparently looked interesting to someone. She had learned the animal work alongside the medical work. She had learned to read the specific language of animals that had been to war, and it was not so different from the language of people who had been to war, which was a thing she'd already known how to read. She had worked with 11 dogs over 22 months. Recon was the 4th. She knew it wasn't the same dog. Couldn't be, she'd told herself this morning when they'd wheeled him in and something in her chest had pulled sideways. The dog she'd worked with in that program had been young then, barely 2 years old, which would make him roughly 15 or 16 now, and that math didn't add up to the 13-year-old in the intake room. But the behavioral fingerprint was similar enough to put her right back in that Northwest facility, sitting on a concrete floor at 2 a.m. with a shepherd who couldn't stop pacing, speaking low into the dark. She had left the program and the Army 6 years ago. She had not left cleanly. There had been an investigation, a series of administrative hearings, a decision that had been described to her as a mutual separation and had not felt mutual. She had signed papers. She had not been permitted to explain to anyone she knew what the papers contained. She had taken her nursing credentials into the civilian sector and built a life that was functional, that was productive, that was entirely without the specific texture of the years she wasn't allowed to discuss. She had not talked about any of this since the day she'd signed. She had maybe, in the worst moments, thought that particular part of her life was sealed shut, that it existed somewhere behind glass that she could look at but not touch. Recon's specific panic, his exact pattern of distress, the way his body had remembered contact before his brain caught up, had walked right through the glass like it was nothing. The afternoon brought 3 trauma admissions back-to-back, a medication error caught by Nora in someone else's notes that she corrected without reporting it through official channels because the nurse who'd made it was a 23-year-old named Marcus, who was already struggling and didn't need a formal incident when the error was caught before implementation. She mentioned it to him quietly, directly, without cruelty. He went pale and said thank you, and she told him to build a double-check habit for that specific drug class and moved on. Around 3 p.m., she passed Recon's recovery room. He was in a modified space off the veterinary unit, sedated now for a post-examination rest protocol, monitored, the knee newly imaged and apparently healing correctly, according to Stern's notes. Alderman was outside the room with his phone in his hand, typing something. He looked up when she passed. "Hey," he said. She stopped. "What you did this morning?" He wasn't looking at his phone anymore. I've been working with canines for 6 years. I've seen handlers who've trained their whole careers try what you did and fail. Where did you learn that?" She looked at him for a moment. He wasn't asking to build a file on her. He was asking because he actually wanted to know, and there was a quality of bewilderment in it that she found, despite everything, almost touching. "You read a room," she said. "You read the dog. You let go of needing the situation to go a specific way, and you wait for what's actually there." Alderman nodded slowly. "That sounds like something that takes a long time to learn." "It does," she said, and kept walking. She wasn't 15 feet away when Alderman said, "He had something in his harness." She slowed. "We found it during the examination." When Stern removed the tactical vest for the imaging, there was a pocket in the lining, sewn shut with pretty heavy thread, old thread, like it had been there a while. He paused. Inside was a photograph. Nora turned around. Alderman was watching her with an expression that was careful and complicated. "It's a woman," he said. "Younger. Standing with a dog. I don't know the dog, but Stern says the harness markings in the photo match a K9 program out of a facility that no longer exists. We're trying to verify the timeline." The hallway was not loud. The fluorescence buzzed very faintly at a frequency she'd learned to ignore. Somewhere a door opened and closed with the soft hydraulic sigh of a hospital door. "Okay," she said. "The woman in the photograph," Alderman said, and his voice had gone to something quieter, more careful. "I've been looking at it for the last hour. I'm not certain, but I think I'd like you to come look at it too." The silence between them was only about 3 seconds long, but it held the weight of 6 years. She didn't move right away. That was the thing Alderman would remember later when he was asked to describe the sequence of events. Not that she went pale, not that she looked afraid, but that she simply stopped, like something inside her had hit a wall it hadn't expected to find there, and she needed a second to decide what to do with the impact. Then she walked back toward him. He held the door open. The recovery room was dim, the overhead lights dialed to about 40% for the dog's rest protocol, and Recon was on a padded platform in the corner, sedated, his breathing slow and even, the soft knee brace visible on his rear left leg. "Doctor." Stern had left a clipboard on the rolling cart beside him, with her post-examination notes clipped to the front, and the tactical vest, heavy, worn, the kind of gear that accumulates years the way old leather does, was spread on the examination table near the window. Alderman crossed to the table and picked up a small, clear evidence bag. Inside was a photograph roughly the size of a playing card, the kind printed on matte paper in the early 2000s. The colors shifted slightly toward yellow, the way photographs do when they've been somewhere dark and warm for a long time. He held it out. Nora took the bag, looked at it. In the photograph, a young woman in army fatigues stood beside a Belgian Malinois maybe 8 months old, holding the dog's lead with one hand and not smiling exactly, but with an expression that was not unhappy. Present. Whatever she was looking at was slightly to the left of the camera, and the dog was looking directly at the lens with the alert, measuring quality that working dogs have, even at 8 months, already something. The young woman's hair was loose, which was unusual for a photograph taken anywhere near a military installation, and she was thinner than she was now, and her face had the particular openness of someone who hadn't yet learned to keep everything back. But it was her face. Nora handed the bag back without saying anything. Alderman was watching her. "You've seen this photograph before." It wasn't a question. She'd put the bag down too carefully. "No," she said. "I didn't take it." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something behind her eyes ran a quick calculation. "I don't know how it got in that harness," she said, "and I'm not going to be able to tell you more than that right now." Alderman nodded slowly. He didn't push. Either he understood that pushing wasn't the right play, or he understood that what she'd just said contained more information than its surface, and he needed time to figure out what to do with it. She read him as smart, not the showy kind, but the functional kind, the kind that comes from working high-stress environments with animals that can't lie. "I'm required to log the photograph as a recovered item," he said, "and I'm going to have to report the image to my commanding officer. That's not optional." "I know. Whatever's in your history, whatever that program was, it's going to get surfaced." "I know that too," she said. She left before he could say anything else. The rest of her shift had the quality of a dream. Where you're aware something is wrong, but the wrong thing is out of frame. She worked. She answered questions. She moved through the ward with the same competence she always brought, and the same deliberate quietness that people here still read as coldness, because they didn't have enough information to read it accurately. Inside, the photograph was sitting in the center of her chest like a stone she'd swallowed. She had not taken that picture. She knew who had. His name was Dario Vasquez, and he had been the senior handler for the dog in that photograph. A Malinois the program had designated K904, informal name Sable, who had been Nora's first assignment when she transferred to the Northwest facility. Dario was 6 years older than her and had the kind of humor that only emerged in situations other people found unbearable, and he was the person who had first explained to her, in terms that were neither gentle nor cruel, how to read a working dog's nervous system like a text in a language she hadn't learned yet. He had carried a battered point-and-shoot camera everywhere, which was technically against protocol, and he had taken photographs of everything because he said if nobody documented the small things, then when the program ended, and it would end, he said, all programs end, it would be like it never existed. Nora didn't know where Dario Vasquez was now. She'd lost contact with everyone from that period after the separation. That had been part of the deal, formal and informal. She didn't know how a photograph he'd taken ended up sewn into the lining of a tactical vest belonging to a retired combat dog in Wyoming in 2024. But someone had put it there, and that meant someone had put it there for a reason. Pollock found her at 5:40, 7 minutes before her shift ended, which she recognized as deliberate. He'd timed it to catch her when she couldn't reasonably extend the conversation without going into unpaid hours. And he'd timed it where they were slightly apart from the main nursing station, just enough to make it feel private without witnesses. I spoke to HR, he said. There are some gaps in your file. She was logging her end-of-shift notes. She kept writing. What kind of gaps? Your military service, you listed 4 years, but the branch records HR pulled show a transfer in your 3rd year to a unit with no further documentation. The file just closes, like somebody pulled the last third of a book. She saved her notes, closed the tablet. Military files are frequently incomplete in the civilian HR system. That's a records transfer issue, not a disclosure issue. That depends on what was in those records. She turned to look at him. Garrett, what exactly are you accusing me of? He had the look of a man who'd prepared this conversation and was now navigating slightly off script. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm following up on an administrative concern. If you had training or credentials that are relevant to patient and animal care in this facility, they need to be on file. That's not optional. I'm a licensed RN with a current certification and a clean record. That's what needs to be on file. The incident this morning, the dog is fine, she said. The handlers are fine. The examination was completed without sedation trauma. If you're trying to make this morning's outcome into an administrative problem, I'm genuinely not sure what to do with that. Pollock's expression did the thing it did when he couldn't land a punch the way he'd planned. It tightened at the corners, all the performance draining out and leaving something smaller underneath. I'm having your full file reviewed, he said. If there's anything in your history that reflects a problem with transparency, that's going to be a very uncomfortable conversation. For which one of us, she said, and picked up her bag and walked out. She made it to the parking lot before her hands started shaking. Not hard, not visibly hard, but the specific low vibration that her body produced when adrenaline had nowhere to go. She sat in her car for 10 minutes before she trusted herself to drive. The engine running, the heat kicking on against the November cold, watching the hospital entrance through the windshield without seeing it. The photograph. Someone had sewn a photograph of her into that dog's harness. Not taped it, not tucked it into a pocket, sewn it. Thread, needle, deliberate work. That was not an accident, and it was not a coincidence, and it meant someone had known, at some point before today, that the dog would end up somewhere Nora would see him. Or, the other possibility, the one that made less immediate sense but wouldn't leave her alone. Someone had known the dog would end up somewhere, and had hoped. She drove home on autopilot, muscle memory carrying her through streets she'd only had 6 weeks to learn, and she made food she didn't taste, and sat at her kitchen table and turned the possibilities over and over, and she did not sleep well, which was not new, but was worse than usual. In the morning, 3 things happened before 8 a.m. The first was that Priya appeared at her elbow at the medication station, with the quiet urgency of someone who had been thinking about how to start a conversation since the previous evening. Pollock filed something, she said, yesterday afternoon. I don't know exactly what, because it went through the administrative channel rather than the departmental one, but I know because Hessa in records mentioned it to me, and she said the language in it was, she used the word pointed. Nora kept counting the medication draw she was working on. What kind of pointed? She said it used the phrase undisclosed background twice and breach of credential transparency once. The count was accurate. Nora logged it. Thanks for telling me. Are you going to be okay? She looked at Priya then, this woman who had handed her a paper coffee cup on her third day and said, I don't really do the welcome wagon thing, but you look like you could use this, who had covered for her once during a crossover admission without being asked, who was one of approximately 2 people in this building Nora would categorize, carefully, as a decent human being. I don't know yet, she said, which was the most honest answer she had. The second thing was that Alderman was back. He was in the corridor outside the veterinary unit when she passed it, not in his uniform today, which registered civilian clothes, which meant he was here off duty, which meant this was personal rather than assignment. He had a coffee from the machine down the hall and the posture of someone who'd been standing there long enough that the coffee had cooled. They sent someone, he said, when she stopped. Who? My CO. After I filed the report about the photograph last night, he forwarded it up the chain. This morning, I got a call. He looked at his cup. Someone from a DoD oversight office is coming to review Recon's records. His full service file, his placement history, the circumstances of his retirement. He paused. And the recovered item. Nora's chest went tight in a way she didn't let reach her face. When? Tomorrow, maybe the day after. He looked at her now, directly. They're going to want to talk to you. I figured. They're also going to want to know about the program, the one in your file that doesn't have documentation. He said it carefully. I don't know what that program was. I don't have clearance to know. But whatever it is, it's not staying quiet much longer. She understood that. She'd been understanding it in slow increments since the moment she'd looked at that photograph. How's he doing? She asked. Not to change the subject, genuinely. Alderman's expression shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile. Better. Stern says the knee looks good. He slept through the night. A beat. He was asking for you this morning. She raised an eyebrow. He keeps going to the door, Alderman said, listening. Stern thinks he can hear your voice when you're in the corridor. That landed somewhere in the middle of her sternum, and she made herself not react to it. I'll stop in, she said. She did briefly, between 2 patient checks. Recon was awake, sitting up, the sedation fully cleared, and when she opened the door, he did not bark. He lifted his head, watched her cross the room. When she crouched beside him and put her hand on his neck, his tail moved twice, not the performance of a happy dog, just the quiet acknowledgement of something that felt correct. And he put his head down again with a sigh that came from somewhere low in his chest. She stayed for 4 minutes. She had to be somewhere else. The third thing that happened before 8 a.m. was Pollock. He was waiting outside the East Ward with a woman Nora had never seen before, mid-50s, reading glasses on a chain, the particular kind of professional posture that said administrative authority rather than clinical. HR director, Nora guessed. Possibly legal. Carter. Pollock's voice had a different quality today. Not the casual venom of his normal register, something more formal, more prepared. This is Ren Solano, our Director of Personnel Operations. She has some questions. Solano offered a hand. Her grip was businesslike. Can we step into the conference room? It won't take long. It took 45 minutes. Solano asked her questions in the methodical way of someone who'd done this many times. Not aggressive, not friendly, just systematic. She had Nora's file in front of her, the civilian portion, and she asked about every entry, and then she asked about what wasn't there. She asked about the transfer in year 3. She asked about the 18 months following Nora's discharge before her nursing certification. She asked twice, in 2 different framings, whether Nora had ever worked in a capacity involving military animals or specialized handling that wasn't documented in her civilian personnel file. Nora answered what she could answer. She said clearly that portions of her military service were under a confidentiality designation and that she was not in a position to disclose specifics without legal review. Solano made notes. Her face was neutral in the way faces are neutral when they're working not to signal an outcome. Pollock said almost nothing during the session, which was more unsettling than if he'd pushed, because it meant he didn't think he needed to. He sat to the left of Solano with a legal pad in front of him that he wrote on twice, and he watched Nora with the expression of a man who believed he had already won something and was merely watching the paperwork catch up. When the session ended, Solano collected her materials and said that she'd be in touch, and Pollock stood up first and looked at Nora with something he was trying to pass off as concern. "I want you to know this isn't personal," he said. She looked at him. She did not say anything. She picked up her bag and left. She did not tell Priya the details. She told her it had been an HR meeting, which was accurate, and Priya read what she didn't say with the intelligence of someone who had been paying attention, and she didn't push. The ward was busy through the midday hours. 3 new veteran admissions, a complex wound assessment that pulled Nora into a 4-way consultation with the surgical team, a medication escalation on a long-stay patient that required recalculating the entire protocol from the previous evening's bloods. She worked. She didn't let the morning leak into the work because she had never been able to afford to. It was around 1:30 during the 20-minute window that was technically lunch that she went to the staff restroom and sat on the closed lid of a toilet in the 3rd stall and pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. The problem, the actual problem, the one underneath the photo and Pollock's file and Alderman's warning, was that the program she'd been assigned to didn't officially exist. That was not a figure of speech. It had operated under a classification tier that meant the personnel who passed through it were listed, on paper, as attached to a base administrative unit in a completely different state. Their specific work, their specific training, their specific outcomes were not documented in any system accessible to HR departments or civilian credential reviewers. This had been presented to Nora at the time as a protection, and she had believed that because she had been 26 and trusted the institution she'd given 4 years to. What she had understood later, gradually, over the years of her civilian life, was that classification at that level was also containment. If the program's purpose was ever scrutinized, the people who had worked it could be managed, kept quiet, reminded of what they'd signed. She had been reminded of it, in fact, during the separation process. The conversation had been professional. The message had been clear. The photograph in Recon's harness meant someone had decided to put something into motion that the classification was meant to prevent. Someone had wanted Nora's name attached to this dog. Someone had wanted the question asked. She didn't know if that someone was Dario Vasquez. She didn't know if she should be grateful or afraid. She washed her face at the sink, looked at herself in the mirror for about 3 seconds without sentiment, and went back to the ward. The call came at 4:55. She was still in the building, finishing a medication handoff to the evening nurse, a quiet, competent man named Roland, who she'd worked beside enough to trust his judgment, when her personal phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number, Wyoming area code. She let it go to voicemail, finished the handoff, retrieved her bag, stepped into the cold outside, the sky the specific color of Wyoming November that was neither gray nor white, but both simultaneously, and she listened. The voicemail was 43 seconds long. The voice was a man's, mid-50s maybe, a particular kind of deliberate calm in it that she associated with people who had spent a long time in operational environments. He said, "Nora, you don't know me. My name is Warren Galt. I served in a program adjacent to yours between 2009 and 2011. I was on the oversight side. I know what was in that harness because I put it there. I need to explain some things to you, but not on a phone and not in a hospital. There's a diner called Elk Creek Cafe out on Route 24, about 11 miles east of Dalton Springs. Tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. I know you're on the afternoon shift. I'll be there whether you come or not." A pause, just long enough to feel intentional. There are people who have been looking for a reason to open the program's records for a long time. Recon was the cleanest way to do it. You need to understand what that means before the DoD review team gets here. The message ended. She stood in the parking lot for a long time. The cold cut through her jacket, and the hospital entrance glowed white behind her, and 1,000 feet overhead, a military cargo plane was tracking east, its running lights blinking in steady, patient rhythm against the darkening sky. And she thought about a photograph sewn into a harness, and a dog who recognized something in her that no one in this building was supposed to know she'd once been. And she made a decision. She would go. She had to know what they'd done with the program's records. She had to know what was coming. And somewhere underneath all of it, underneath the fear and the calculation and the years of careful, controlled silence, there was something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She was almost to her car when Priya called out from the entrance. "Nora." There was something in her voice. Not urgency exactly, closer to warning. Nora turned. Priya was in the doorway with her phone in her hand and her face arranged into the specific neutral that Nora had learned meant bad news coming at controlled speed. "Pollock just posted the schedule for next week," Priya said. "You've been moved." "Moved where?" "Overnight supply management." A pause. "He's pulled you off active patient care. No explanation in the system yet. Just the schedule change." The air between them was still. "That's not a reassignment," Nora said. "No," Priya said. "It isn't." The cargo plane had disappeared. The parking lot lights had come on without Nora noticing, the way things changed in winter. One minute there was enough light, and then suddenly there wasn't, and you couldn't identify the exact moment it had shifted, only that it had. Pollock hadn't filed a complaint to protect the hospital. He'd done it to move her somewhere she couldn't be seen, and that was the part that made her stomach drop. Not the reassignment itself, not even the pettiness of it, but the specific mechanism Pollock had chosen. Overnight supply management wasn't a disciplinary posting in any formal sense. It wasn't a suspension. It didn't trigger a grievance process or require documentation of cause. It was just a schedule change, technically within a supervisor's authority, and it would move her out of any space where the DoD review team might encounter her organically, where patients or handlers or anyone else might point to her and say, "That's the one. She's the one who matters here." It was administrative erasure dressed as routine. He'd done this before. She didn't know yet how she knew that, but she knew it. Priya was still watching her from the doorway, the cold coming in around her, and Nora made herself breathe through the specific tightness in her throat that was anger and something older than anger underneath it. "When does it take effect?" she said. "Monday." 4 days. She had 4 days before she was moved into a basement storage role with no patient contact and no visibility, and somewhere in that window a DoD review team was arriving with questions about a program that officially did not exist. And a man named Warren Galt was sitting in a diner 11 miles east of town, waiting to tell her something she didn't yet have language for. "Okay," she said. She drove home with her hands at 10 and 2 and the radio off. Elk Creek Cafe was the kind of place that had been in the same building for 40 years and had decided that was credential enough. The menu laminated over older lamination, the coffee arriving in mugs with a history, the booths running along the east wall with seats that had compressed to the shape of everyone who'd ever sat in them. The morning rush, such as it was in a town of 1,400, had thinned by 7 to a handful of locals with nowhere urgent to be. And the woman behind the counter refilled coffee without being asked and looked at no one in particular. Warren Galt was already there. He was mid-60s, not mid-50s as she'd guessed from his voice. The kind of person who had probably looked this age for a decade and would look it for another. Close-cut gray hair, a canvas jacket that had been everywhere it looked like it had been, and the specific way of sitting in a public space that people develop after years of wanting to see every entrance. He had coffee in front of him and his hands on the table, and he watched her walk in with no visible reaction. She slid into the seat across from him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "You came," he said. "You knew I would." "I hoped." He turned his mug a quarter rotation. "I didn't know." She looked at him. The lines in his face, the economy of his movement, the specific quality of steadiness that didn't come from comfort, but from having been through enough that steadiness was just what was left on the other side. "Who are you?" she said. Not aggressively. She genuinely wanted the answer. "I ran the administrative oversight for the Canine Rehabilitation Program from 08 to 12. Not the animal work, the documentation side. I was responsible for maintaining the internal records that the classification kept out of the public file system." He paused. "Which means I'm one of maybe 6 people alive who have the complete picture of what that program did and who was in it. And the photograph was taken by a handler named Vasquez. He gave it to me before he separated, 2013. Said if anything ever needed to be proved about that program, that image was one of the cleanest pieces of evidence, because the dog in it is identifiable by his markings. The facility in the background is identifiable by 3 specific architectural details, and the woman in it is identifiable as a nurse currently practicing in Wyoming who holds credentials traceable directly to her Army service. He looked at her. He wanted someone to be able to make a case. He didn't know when. He just wanted the possibility to exist. Nora's coffee arrived. She wrapped her hands around the mug and didn't drink it. Dario knew they'd try to fold me back in, she said, or fold me out. One or the other. Yes. What happened to him? Something moved through Galt's face. He's been working with a veterans canine therapy nonprofit in Oregon. He's fine. He wanted to be here, so I told him not yet. Too many people converging would read as coordinated, which it is, but we needed it to look organic. The DoD review team, filed 3 days ago by a lieutenant colonel named Adrienne Marsh out of the Army Inspector General's office. She's been building a case for 18 months, not specifically about your program, but about a pattern of classification misuse across several programs from that era. Programs where personnel were brought in under specialized operational designations, and then, when the programs ended, their service records were effectively sealed in ways that prevented them from claiming full credit for their service. Benefits, commendations, career trajectory. He turned the mug again. The habit of it. Your separation agreement, the one you signed. Yes. It contained language that was, according to 3 military law attorneys Marsh has consulted, not legally enforceable as written. The confidentiality provisions you agreed to were broader than what the military is permitted to impose on discharged personnel under Title 10. But you didn't know that, because you signed without independent legal review, which you weren't advised to seek. The cafe was quiet around them. Someone ordered eggs. The counterwoman laughed at something. So the photograph, Nora said slowly. Getting recon to this hospital was the cleanest way to create a paper trail that connects you to the program without you having to disclose anything yourself. Recon's service records, which are military property and not subject to your separation agreement, reference his early rehabilitation history at the facility. The photograph connects you to that history. Marsh's team can use both to build a factual record that supports reopening your personnel file. He looked at her steadily. You didn't have to do anything. You just had to be here when the dog arrived. She sat with that for a long moment. And if I'd refused to go into the intake room, she said, then Alderman would have found a reason to ask you about the dog anyway. We had a secondary approach. He said it without apology. But we didn't need it. She understood then that this had been built around her without her knowledge, which was, she examined the feeling, complicated. Not quite violation. Not quite relief. Something in the uncomfortable space between being used and being protected, and the discomfort of not being certain which one it was. What does Marsh's team actually need from me, she asked. A voluntary statement, on the record, about your work in the program, what you did, what you were told, what happened when you separated. Nothing you say can be used against you under the terms of the IG investigation. Marsh has prosecutorial immunity lined up. He paused. But it has to be voluntary. And it has to be soon. The review team arrives at Hargrove Memorial Day after tomorrow. I've been reassigned, she said. Overnight supply. As of Monday. Galt's expression didn't change, but something behind it sharpened. By whom? Garrett Pollock, my floor supervisor. On what basis? He hasn't given one. Schedule change, within his administrative authority. Galt was quiet for a moment. Has he been in contact with anyone from the facility's military liaison office? Or made any inquiries about your background to anyone outside the hospital's HR chain? She hadn't considered that. The question reoriented something in her thinking. I don't know. I'd like to know, he said. Before Marsh's team walks in. She drove back to Dalton Springs with the heater running and her mind running faster. By the time she reached the hospital, she wasn't on shift until 2. But there was nowhere else she wanted to think. She had the bare architecture of what Galt had told her, arranged into something she could look at without flinching. Priya was on a break in the small staff room off the main corridor, eating something from a container that smelled like it had turmeric in it when Nora pushed the door open. I need to ask you something, Nora said, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Priya put the container down. Has Pollock talked to anyone outside the hospital about me? Not HR. Outside the building. Military liaison, Veterans Affairs coordinator, anyone in the administrative military chain? Priya was quiet in a thinking way rather than a reluctant way. 2 weeks ago, she said finally, maybe 3. He had a long call in his office. I was walking past, door wasn't fully closed. I caught maybe 30 seconds of it. He was asking someone about disclosure requirements for personnel with classified military backgrounds working in contract medical facilities. She paused. I thought it was about something else. A general policy question. It wasn't. No, Priya said slowly, arriving at the same place. It wasn't general, was it? I don't know what he found out or who he talked to, but I need to find out before day after tomorrow. Priya looked at her with the expression of someone who has been a bystander long enough and has now decided quietly and completely to stop. What can I do? She said. What Priya could do turned out to be specific and unexpected. She had, in her 4 years at Hargrove Memorial, become close with the hospital's veteran liaison coordinator, a man named Otis Burke, who'd done 20 years in the Army before transitioning to a civilian administrative role and who maintained relationships across both the clinical and military sides of the facility. He was not someone Pollock would have thought to consider as a variable. Priya texted him at 11 a.m. He called back within 20 minutes. He confirmed, carefully, and with the kind of language that meant he understood exactly what he was saying and why, that Garrett Pollock had called his office 7 days ago requesting information about disclosure frameworks for staff with undocumented classified service histories. He had not given Pollock anything substantive because the request had struck him as jurisdictionally wrong. That type of inquiry went to the facility's military oversight board, not to a floor supervisor. But he had noted the call, and he still had the note. He was willing to provide that documentation to whoever needed it. Nora asked Priya to thank him. Then she called the number Galt had given her. He picked up on the second ring. Pollock called the Veteran Liaison Office 7 days ago, she said, asking about disclosure frameworks for classified service records. The coordinator has documentation. A pause. That changes the timeline, Galt said. If Pollock has been making inquiries about your background and then moved you off active care 4 days before a DOD review, that's not just administrative overreach. That's potentially obstruction of an active IG investigation. Can Marsh use it? If it's properly documented and voluntarily provided by the coordinator, yes. Another pause, shorter. Nora, are you prepared to be the person at the center of this? Because once Marsh's team arrives and this starts moving, it will move fast. She looked at the wall of the parking lot where she was standing, the concrete stained with years of weather, a crack running from the base up to about waist height that had been there long enough to grow a thin, dark line of something in it. I've been prepared, she said. I just didn't know it was this. The day after tomorrow arrived the way consequential days do, quietly, with no atmospheric indication that it was any different from the day before. The sky was the same November pewter. The hospital smelled identical. The elevator made its usual complaint on the way to the 3rd floor. Lieutenant Colonel Adrienne Marsh arrived at 8 a.m. with 2 members of her team, both in civilian clothes, both with the particular posture of people who were used to rooms reorienting around them when they walked in. Marsh herself was a compact woman of about 50, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses she wore on her face rather than around her neck, which struck Nora, irrationally, as the detail of someone who did not have time for theater. They were met in the lobby by the hospital's director, a man named Halverson, who ran the facility with the low-key efficiency of someone who'd seen enough crises to know which ones required performance and which ones required simply getting out of the way. Pollock was also in the lobby. He had not been told the review team was coming, which Nora found out later was deliberate. Marsh had requested that the facility director not provide advance notice to departmental supervisors, citing the active nature of the inquiry. Pollock had heard through the facility's internal notification system that a DOD representative team had arrived, and he had come down to the lobby because that was what Pollock did when he felt his authority was proximate to something important. He positioned himself near it. Marsh looked at him once, assessed him in the way she probably assessed everything, efficiently, and then turned back to Halverson. We'll need a conference room and access to personnel files for 3 individuals. I have the authorization paperwork here. She produced a folder. We'll also need to speak with the facility's veteran liaison coordinator and with a member of your current nursing staff, Nora Carter. Pollock said. Carter has been temporarily reassigned. I'm aware of the schedule change, Marsh said. She had not looked at him again. That's actually one of the things we need to discuss. The silence in the lobby was the particular kind that forms when everyone present understands that a balance of power has just shifted, and different people in the room are processing that shift at different speeds. Pollock's face went through several things in about 4 seconds. Nora, who had been standing near the elevator corridor precisely because she'd been told by Halverson, quietly, via Priya, via a chain of decent people being decent, that she might want to be visible this morning, watched it happen from 30 feet away. She was not going to pretend she didn't feel something. She felt something. The first session with Marsh's team lasted 3 hours. It was held in the second-floor conference room that the hospital used for department head meetings, and it was just Nora and Marsh and one of her team members, a woman named Specialist Foe, who took notes on a laptop with the speed of someone transcribing live and the attention of someone who was simultaneously reading everything behind what was being said. Marsh had a way of asking questions that didn't feel like interrogation and also somehow felt exactly like interrogation. Not because she was aggressive, but because she was so genuinely interested in the accurate answer that there was nowhere to hide behind a partial one. She asked about Nora's enlistment, her early service, her transfer to the program. She asked about the work itself, the animals, the methodology, the specific outcomes Nora could describe. She asked about the separation, and she asked about the agreement Nora had signed. And when Nora said she hadn't had independent legal review, Marsh wrote something down and didn't look up. Nora told her everything she was legally able to tell her, and then she told her a few things she'd spent 6 years believing she wasn't legally able to tell her. And Marsh received all of it with the same focused steadiness and never once said, "Are you sure?" or "That seems significant." She just asked the next question, which was in some ways more unsettling, and in other ways the most respectful form of listening Nora had experienced in a long time. At the end of the 3 hours, Marsh took her glasses off, cleaned them with the hem of her jacket, and put them back on. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "The separation agreement you signed in 2018, our legal team's review indicates that sections 4 through 7 of the confidentiality provisions exceed what is permissible under the relevant statutes. Those sections are not enforceable. You have not been in violation of any legally binding agreement by speaking with us today." Nora had known this was coming. Galt had told her as much. But hearing it in this room, from this specific person, with her documentation and her legal team and her 200-page preliminary file, was something different from knowing it abstractly. "What happens now?" she asked. "We'll spend today reviewing the facility's personnel and administrative records. Specifically, I'm interested in the schedule modification filed against you 4 days before our arrival and the prior contact Mr. Pollock made with this facility's Veteran Liaison Office." She paused. "I'd also like to speak with Sergeant Alderman and Dr. Stern regarding the recovered item from the K-9's harness." "And recon?" Marsh looked at her, a slightly different quality of attention. "The dog is part of the record, yes. His service file, his placement history, the circumstances of his retirement, all of it feeds the broader case." A beat. "He'll remain at this facility through the review, which, given what you've told me about his response to your presence, is probably the better outcome for him regardless." She said it like a practical observation. It was also, Nora recognized, something slightly kinder than a practical observation. The afternoon was the strange, suspended kind. The review team was in the building, behind closed doors, pulling records and conducting interviews that Nora was not part of, and she was on her regular shift in a facility where everyone knew something was happening and most people didn't know what. She did her work. She checked on recon once, mid-afternoon, and he was awake and calm, and his knee assessment from that morning had come back clean enough that Stern was talking about a mobility protocol starting next week. She was in the medication room at 4:15 when Priya appeared in the doorway with the specific look of someone carrying information they're not sure how to hand over. "Pollock's been in with the review team for the last hour," she said. "I know. He came out about 20 minutes ago." Priya's voice was careful. "He looked... Nora, I've worked here 4 years and I've never seen him look like that." Nora kept logging the medication count. "Like what?" "Like someone told him something he didn't have an answer for." Priya paused. "He went straight to his office. He's been in there since. His assistant said he's been on the phone." The medication count was accurate. She logged it. Okay, she said. That's all you've got? Okay? Nora looked at her. There was something she wanted to say that was large and complicated and would take a long time to say properly, about the 6 years between the signing of that agreement and this afternoon in a medication room in Wyoming, about what it costs to keep something sealed, about the specific weight of being a person who contains a history that the world around her doesn't have access to. She wanted to say it and couldn't, so instead she said, I'll tell you everything, after. Priya nodded. She understood after. At 5:50, Nora's phone buzzed. A text from a number she'd saved under Galt's name. Marsh has the liaison documentation. Also pulled Pollock's admin history at the facility. There's more there than we expected. Stand by. She read it twice. Stand by was not a phrase she'd associated with this situation 24 hours ago, but it was accurate. There was nothing to do right now except wait for whatever was moving to arrive. She was putting her phone away when she turned the corner toward the east corridor and nearly walked into Garrett Pollock. He looked bad. That was the plainest way to put it. Not sick, not injured, but the specific bad of a person whose internal structure has recently taken damage that the exterior hasn't fully processed yet. His jacket was slightly crooked, which she'd never seen, and he was holding his phone too hard. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I want you to know I was trying to protect the hospital. She waited. If you had undisclosed background that created liability. Garrett. She said his name once, flatly, not with anger. Don't. He stopped. Don't do that in front of me, she said. You know what you were doing. He held her gaze for about 3 seconds. Then he looked away. She went around him and kept walking, and she was almost to the stairwell when she heard his voice behind her, quieter, stripped of its usual architecture. What did you tell them? She didn't turn around. The truth, she said. She pushed through the stairwell door. She was 2 flights up when her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number she didn't recognize. Out-of-state area code, Oregon. She stopped on the landing, picked up. A voice she hadn't heard in 6 years said, Hey Carter, it's Dario. There's something you need to know before tomorrow morning. Something Marsh's team is about to find in those records that nobody warned you about. Her hand tightened on the phone. Tell me, she said. The stairwell was cold and fluorescent and completely empty, and Nora stood on the landing between the 2nd and 3rd floors with the phone pressed to her ear and waited for Dario Vasquez to say the thing he'd called to say. He didn't rush into it. That was like him. She remembered that now, the specific quality of his silences, the way he'd always taken 1 beat longer than necessary before saying anything important, not from uncertainty but from the habit of making sure the words were the right ones. The program's internal records, he said, the ones Galt maintained. The documentation Marsh's team is pulling right now. Yes. There's a file in there, Personnel Action Log 2018, covers the last 4 months before the program's formal dissolution. You're in it. He paused. But not the way you think. Not just as a staff member who separated. She waited. There was a commendation, he said, filed by the program's senior medical officer, a colonel named Reyes. She retired in 2020. It was submitted through the standard channel in March of 2018, about 8 weeks before your separation. Formal commendation, specific to your work with K904 and 2 other animals whose recovery outcomes were flagged as clinically significant. Another pause. It was intercepted at the administrative level and never forwarded, never entered into your service record. Reyes filed it, and it just stopped. The fluorescent light above her hummed. Somewhere above, a door opened and closed. Someone buried it, she said. Someone buried it. And Marsh's team is going to find it, if they haven't already, because Galt kept a copy in the internal record. He kept copies of everything, which is why he was worth his weight in whatever, because most people in oversight positions don't bother. A breath. Nora, it's a commendation with specific language. Language that, if it had been processed, would have changed your separation classification. Your benefits tier. Possibly the entire framing of what happened to you in 2018. She sat down on the step. Just sat down, right there on the concrete, because her legs made a decision her brain hadn't caught up to yet. Reyes knew, she said. Reyes was the one who pushed for it. She's the one who told Galt about the intercept. Not at the time, she didn't know at the time. She found out afterward, maybe a year later, when she was trying to follow up on a different personnel matter and stumbled on the administrative trail. She went to Galt. Galt documented it. Who intercepted it? A beat. That's the part you need to be ready for, Dario said, because it wasn't random. It was a specific person making a specific decision, and that person's name is in Galt's documentation. Another beat. Careful. His name is Mitchell Crane. He was the liaison officer between the program and the hospital's military contract administration. He left the Army in 2019 and went into private healthcare administration. She was already ahead of him. She felt it landing before the sentence was finished. He's not in private healthcare administration anymore, she said. No, Dario said. About 3 years ago, he took a position at a contract military medical facility in Wyoming, deputy administrative director. The hum of the light. The cold of the step through her scrubs. He's at Hargrove Memorial, she said. He's been there since 2021, Dario said, and Garrett Pollock reports directly to him. She sat on that step for approximately 90 seconds. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket, and called Galt. He picked up before the first ring finished. You talked to Vasquez. Mitchell Crane is the deputy administrative director at this hospital, she said. I know, Marsh knows. Her team identified him this afternoon during the records pull. He's currently in a session with Marsh and her legal officer. A pause that had weight in it. He didn't know the review was connected to the program until about 2 hours ago. Up until then, he thought it was a general IG inquiry. When Marsh put the commendation document in front of him, Another pause. It did not go well for him. He intercepted a formal commendation. Intercepted, reclassified as administrative hold, and then failed to act on it within the 30-day processing window, which under military personnel regulations constitutes effective suppression. It's not a gray area. Galt's voice was even, but she'd known him less than 48 hours and she could already hear something underneath the evenness. Crane's attorney has been called. Marsh's team is not finished with him tonight. Nora thought about Pollock on the phone in his office. Pollock, who reported to Crane. Pollock, who had made that inquiry to the Veteran Liaison Office 7 days ago. And now she was rethinking the timeline on that, rethinking whether Pollock had been operating independently or whether Crane had told him to start building a preemptive file on her once Recon's arrival was flagged in the facility's intake system. Did Crane know Recon was coming here, she asked. That's what Marsh is asking him right now. She pushed out of the stairwell onto the third-floor corridor and stood in the relative noise of the ward. Call lights, the distant sound of a monitor alarm being addressed. 2 nurses talking fast about something at the far station. And she breathed. What do I do right now? She said. You finish your shift, Galt said. You let Marsh's team do what they're doing, and tomorrow morning you come back in because there's going to be a full staff assembly at 9 a.m. and you need to be in the room. Halverson's calling it? Marsh requested it. Halverson agreed. A beat. She's going to lay out the findings to the facility's senior staff. It will include Crane. It will include the commendation. It will include the administrative schedule change and the prior inquiry Pollock made. He paused once more. She's going to do it publicly. She believes institutional accountability requires a public record when institutional authority has been abused. Nora was quiet for a moment. Galt, she said, the commendation. What did it say, specifically? He read it to her. It took about 40 seconds. Colonel Reyes had not written the way bureaucrats wrote. She'd written the way someone writes when they mean something and want the meaning to survive the form it's being put into. She'd described Nora's work with 3 specific animals, 2 of whom had been assessed as non-recoverable before Nora's intervention, and she'd used language that was precise and unadorned and said, clearly, that the outcomes achieved had not been replicated in the program's prior 4 years, and that the personnel responsible for those outcomes deserved recognition proportional to the results. Nora listened. She didn't say anything when he finished. You okay? He said. I don't know yet, she said, which was the same thing she'd said to Priya 2 days ago, and it was still true. She finished the shift. There was no alternative. People needed care regardless of what was moving in the administrative levels of the building, and she was here and capable, and that was the job. She did it the way she always did it, with the attention it required, and she did not let the weight of the evening leak into the work. At 8 o'clock, she stopped by Recon's recovery space. Alderman wasn't there. He'd been in with Marsh's team for a second session and hadn't come back. But Stern had left the light at low and the door unlocked, and Nora let herself in quietly. Recon was awake. He tracked her entry with his eyes, his head lifting from the padded platform. She pulled the single chair in the room next to him and sat, not touching him yet, just present. And he watched her for a moment and then put his head back down with the long exhale that she was learning was his specific sound for you again. Good. She put her hand on his back. His breathing was regular. His muscle tone under her hand was better than yesterday. The constant readiness that reactive animals carry around was loosening, very gradually, in the way it only did when the environment started feeling predictable. Safe was too strong a word. Predictable was accurate. "I know," she said. Low, just to him. "I know." She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She sat there for 12 minutes and then she went home. Well, she did not sleep well. This was not a surprise. She lay in the dark of her Dalton Springs apartment, sparse, functional, a place she'd set up with the clear expectation that it might be temporary. And she thought about Colonel Reyes, who she'd met 4 times and remembered as a woman with a precise handshake and the habit of listening to the end of a sentence before responding, which was rarer than it should have been. She thought about the commendation sitting in a file for 6 years, going nowhere, and the years she'd spent not knowing it existed, not knowing that someone had thought to write it. She thought about Dario in Oregon with his camera and his conviction that the small things needed to be documented. She thought about Mitchell Crane in a room with Marsh's legal officer, and she tried to feel something about that, satisfaction, vindication, and found instead something more like exhaustion, the specific kind that accumulates from maintaining a posture for a long time, and the deep disorientation of being allowed to put it down. She was up before 5, made coffee, stood at the window in the pre-dawn dark. At 8:40, she walked back into Hargrove Memorial. The assembly was in the hospital's main conference center, the large one on the ground floor used for all staff education sessions and occasional joint military-civilian briefings. It held about 90 people comfortably, and there were more than 90 people in it by 8:55, some standing along the back wall, some in seats they'd clearly rushed to claim. The information that something significant was happening had moved through the facility overnight with the efficiency of information that has too much energy behind it to be contained. Marsh was at the front with Halverson. Her 2 team members flanked the presentation setup. She had no slides. She had a folder, open, and the reading glasses on. Nora came in and took a position along the side wall. Priya materialized beside her within 30 seconds, wordlessly, and stood close enough that their arms were almost touching. Alderman was in the 3rd row. He turned when Nora came in, made eye contact, and gave a single small nod that contained something she didn't have a word for but recognized as respect. Pollock was in the room. He was near the back, seated, and he was looking at the front with the fixed attention of someone who has decided that the safest thing they can do right now is not move. Mitchell Crane was not in the room. Halverson opened the assembly at exactly 9. He was brief. He said that Lieutenant Colonel Marsh was present from the Army Inspector General's office conducting a review with direct implications for this facility and its personnel, and that she had findings she wished to share with the assembled staff. He sat down. Marsh stood. She spoke for 40 minutes. She did not perform it. She laid it out. The nature of the IG investigation, the classified program, the personnel who had served in it, and the administrative handling of their separation records. She described, in specific terms, what a formal commendation was and what the consequences were when one was suppressed. She did not use the word criminal, but she used the phrase actionable misconduct 3 times and personnel regulation violation 5 times, and she cited specific statutes with the ease of someone who'd had them memorized for a long time. Then she talked about the schedule modification. She described Garrett Pollock's unilateral reassignment of Nora Carter to overnight supply management 4 days before the review team's arrival. She described his prior contact with the Veteran Liaison Office and the nature of that inquiry. She described the administrative trail that connected those actions to Mitchell Crane's prior knowledge of Nora's background, and she said clearly that the preponderance of documentation indicated that the schedule change was not a routine personnel action, but a deliberate attempt to limit Nora's visibility and access during an active IG investigation. She used the phrase obstruction of investigative process. Once. That was enough. The room was the specific quiet of 90 people who are processing something significant in real time and have agreed wordlessly not to break the processing with sound. Nora looked at the floor, then at the front of the room, then at the floor again. Priya's arm was against hers, steady. Marsh said, "Ms. Carter, would you come up?" And that was the part she hadn't been told about. She walked to the front of the room. Her shoes made the same sound on the floor they always did. She stood beside Marsh, who did not ask her to speak, just turned to face her and held out a document and said for the room, "This is a commendation filed by Colonel Adela Reyes on March 14, 2018, recognizing your work in the Army's K-9 rehabilitation program. It was suppressed at the administrative level before entering your service record. It should have been there for the past 6 years." She held the document out. "It's there now." Nora took it. She looked at it. The paper was a reproduction. The original was evidence. But it was on official letterhead, and it had Reyes's signature at the bottom, the specific forward-leaning signature of someone who signed a lot of things, and meant this one. She did not cry. She was not going to cry in front of 90 people, but her jaw tightened in a way she couldn't fully control, and she let it. When she looked up, Alderman was on his feet. He wasn't clapping. He was just standing, looking at her, which was somehow more than applause. Stern stood next. Then Roland, the evening nurse from 2 days ago, whom she barely knew. Then Priya, who was already standing and made a small sound that was half laugh and half something else. The room came to its feet in pieces, not all at once, not the choreographed kind, the organic kind, people deciding independently and arriving at the same place, which is the only version that means anything. Nora stood at the front, held the document, and let it happen. Mulkin. By 11 o'clock, Pollock's access badge had been deactivated. Halverson had made that call immediately after the assembly, in a brief meeting with his HR director and Marsh's team, and it had been handled with the particular speed of institutional action when the institution has been embarrassed and needs to demonstrate that it can self-correct. Pollock was escorted, not publicly, not in front of the ward staff, because Halverson had at least that much judgment, from the building by 2 members of the administrative team. He had not been arrested. His employment was under formal review pending HR's independent investigation, which would take weeks, but the practical outcome was clear before it officially concluded. Nora heard about the badge deactivation from Priya, who heard it from Hessa in records, who had been present for the administrative meeting because someone needed to pull the access system. The information traveled the way information always traveled through this building, faster than any official communication. She was checking a wound dressing on a veteran patient in room 12 when Priya told her. The patient, an older man named Garth, who'd been here 2 weeks for a post-surgical infection, and had the personality of someone who'd decided long ago that humor was the most efficient response to indignity, raised an eyebrow. "The supervisor who moved you to the night supply job?" he said. "You heard about that," she said. "Honey, I've been in this bed for 2 weeks. I hear everything." He paused. "Good." She finished the dressing. "How's the sight feel?" "Better than yesterday." He looked at her. "You okay?" It was the 3rd time someone had asked her that in 48 hours. She was beginning to think she looked less okay than she felt, or felt less okay than she believed, and neither of those was a comfortable conclusion. "Working on it," she said. He nodded like that was an acceptable answer, which made her like him considerably more. Marsh found her at noon. The lieutenant colonel had the bearing of someone operating well past a standard workday and not planning to stop until the relevant tasks were complete, and she had a cup of coffee from the machine that she was clearly drinking for function rather than enjoyment. "Crane has retained counsel," she said, finding Nora at the nursing station between patient rounds. "He'll be formally notified of the findings by end of business today. The documentation Galt maintained, combined with Reyes's statement, she's agreed to provide one, constitutes a strong evidentiary basis. His attorney will advise him that cooperation is the more favorable path." "What does that mean for the program's other personnel?" Nora said. "The people who are in the file." Marsh looked at her with the expression she had when she was deciding how much to say and had decided, enough. "We've identified 11 individuals whose separation records show similar administrative gaps. Not all of them involve suppressed commendations. Some are benefit classifications, some are service credit issues. We'll be contacting them individually as the review progresses." She paused. "You're the most documented case, which is why we're here. But you're not the only one." Nora processed that. The weight of it. 11 other people living with sealed files, benefits they weren't getting, records that didn't reflect what they'd actually done. Galt knew about all of them, she said. Galt maintained documentation for all of them, Marsh said, which is, at this point, the reason this case is prosecutable. A beat. He spent 14 years maintaining that record, in his own time, on his own equipment, against explicit administrative pressure to close the files. I want you to understand what that looks like from the legal side. That kind of sustained, deliberate documentation is extraordinarily rare. Nora understood it. She also understood, though she didn't say it, that Galt had done that because Dario had told him to, and Dario had done that because he was the kind of person who documented the small things, because the small things were the evidence that something real had happened. What happens to Crane, she said. The DoD will make that determination. At minimum, he's looking at a formal reprimand and loss of his current position. His attorney may negotiate a more formal accountability measure depending on how the evidence is weighted. Marsh's voice was level. He will not be in this building after today. At 2:15, a black government vehicle pulled around to the main entrance. Nora was on the far side of the lobby when it happened. She'd come down for a supply run. And she watched through the glass as Mitchell Crane walked out of the hospital's administrative wing in his own clothes, not a uniform, not a badge, with his attorney beside him and a staff member carrying a box that contained, presumably, the items he'd had in his office. He did not look toward the clinical side of the lobby. He got in the vehicle. The vehicle left. Nora stood at the glass for a moment. Then she went back to work. At 4 p.m., she went to see Recon. Alderman was there this time, sitting in the chair she'd used the previous night, and he stood when she came in with the particular courtesy of someone who has been thinking about how to say something and is relieved to have the opportunity. I owe you an explanation, he said, about the photograph. I knew more about the provenance than I let on when I showed it to you. She looked at him. Vasquez. He contacted me 6 weeks ago. Before Recon's transfer was confirmed, he contacted me through a veteran network channel and told me about the photograph and what it was there for. He said if the transfer came through and the dog ended up at Hargrove, I should make sure the photograph was found during the examination. He had the look of someone reporting an action that he'd taken deliberately and was prepared to defend but wasn't entirely comfortable with. I was operating on incomplete information about the scope of what Marsh was investigating. I knew it was significant. I didn't know how significant. Did you know about Crane? She said. Not until Marsh's team interviewed me yesterday. I knew Pollock was the one who'd moved you. I didn't know the connection above him. He paused. If I had, I might have done things differently. Or I might have done exactly the same things and just known more about why. She looked at Recon, who was watching the door with the posture of an animal that had decided it was in a safe place and was doing the work of learning what that meant. You did the right thing, she said. You're not angry. I'm a lot of things, she said. Angry is in there somewhere. It's not at you. He nodded. Then he said, Marsh mentioned that Recon's placement situation is under review. His original non-placement recommendation was based on his behavioral profile, but the assessment was done by a team that didn't know his full history. Given the last 72 hours, he paused. She thinks there might be a case for an alternate placement, somewhere he has a known contact. He left it at exactly that. Nora looked at the dog. Recon looked back at her with his grave, measuring eyes, and his tail moved, once, twice, in that same quiet way, the acknowledgement of something correct. She didn't say anything yet. She wasn't ready to say it out loud, but she already knew what the answer was going to be. She found the note on her locker at 5:30. A folded piece of paper inside the locker, not under the door, inside, which meant someone with a master key had put it there, with no envelope and no signature. The handwriting was compressed and slightly uneven, the handwriting of someone who doesn't write by hand much anymore. She opened it. The commendation was only part of it. There is a second file, not in Galt's records, in Crane's original suppression documentation, which Marsh's team recovered from his office this afternoon. I don't know if she's seen it yet. I don't know if she'll tell you about it before tomorrow. But you should know it exists before she does. It doesn't change what happened, it changes why. No signature. She read it 3 times. Then she looked at who had access to her locker and ran the short list, and arrived at the one person on it who had reason to know what Crane's files contained, and who had been in Crane's office this afternoon, and who had decided that she needed to know something before tomorrow. She pulled out her phone and called Marsh directly. Marsh picked up on the third ring, and Nora said, "Your team found a second file in Crane's records. I need to know what's in it." A pause, longer than the usual beat. "Where did you hear that?" Marsh said. "Does it matter?" Another pause. "Ms. Carter," Marsh said, and her voice had changed. Not less controlled, but differently controlled. The specific register of someone choosing words with unusual care. "I was planning to speak with you about this first thing tomorrow morning." "Tell me now." The silence on the line lasted 5 seconds. "The second file," Marsh said, "contains a series of internal communications between Crane and a senior officer in the program's command structure from early 2018. The communications indicate that your separation was not initiated for administrative reasons." She paused. "It was recommended by Crane. Specifically because Colonel Reyes had submitted the commendation, and Crane believed that formalizing your record would draw investigative attention to certain aspects of the program's operational history that he wanted to remain undocumented." Nora's hand was very still on the phone. "He pushed me out," she said. "Not because of a compliance issue, because Reyes tried to recognize what I did, and he couldn't let that happen." "That is what the documentation indicates, yes." The locker room was empty and silent, and the light in it was the particular flat light of utility spaces. "Who was the senior officer?" she said. "The one in the communications." Marsh was quiet for exactly the wrong amount of time. "That individual," she said carefully, "is currently still serving." The name Marsh would not give her. Not yet. Not over the phone, not without the proper documentation framework in place, not without the legal officer present. And Nora understood all of those reasons and found them completely intolerable in the specific way that correct procedures become intolerable when the thing you're waiting to know has been sitting in a file for 6 years while you built a smaller life around not knowing it. "Tomorrow morning," Marsh said, 8 a.m. The same conference room. I'll have the full documentation ready and we can go through it properly." "Is he going to be warned?" Nora said. "Before tomorrow. The investigation is active. I cannot discuss operational steps," which meant possibly yes, and Nora had to live with that until morning. She put the phone in her pocket and stood in the empty locker room for a long moment, the note in her hand, the flat light overhead doing nothing useful. And she thought about 6 years. She thought about the apartment between Casper and here, where she'd spent 4 months learning to sleep past 4 a.m., and mostly failing. She thought about the specific way she'd said goodbye to the work she'd loved. Not dramatically, not with argument, just signing her name on a line and walking out a door, because she'd believed she had no other option and no one had told her otherwise. Someone had decided that her record should not reflect what she'd done. Not because of what she'd done wrong, because of what she'd done right, and what the right thing, properly documented, might have illuminated about things certain people needed to stay dark. She folded the note, put it in her pocket, went home, made food she didn't taste, set her alarm for 6 and lay in the dark, and this time, unexpectedly, slept. She was in the conference room at 7:52. Marsh arrived at 7:58 with her legal officer and a second folder that was considerably thicker than the one from the previous morning. Specialist Foe had her laptop open before she sat down. There was coffee on the table from somewhere better than the hospital machine, which Nora registered as a small, deliberate gesture. The kind of thing people do when they know they're about to hand someone something heavy and want to have contributed something that wasn't heavy first. "His name is Brigadier General Paul Stecker," Marsh said, sitting down and opening the folder without preamble. "He commanded the oversight structure for the program's final operational phase from late 2017 through its dissolution in mid-2018. He's currently stationed at Fort Ralston in Virginia, serving in an advisory capacity to the Army's Medical Training Command." She turned the folder so Nora could see the first document, the internal communications Crane had kept, printed on paper that had been copied enough times to have the slightly ghost-pale quality of a document that's traveled. The header read like all military headers read, dense with designation codes and timestamps. And then underneath the codes, the text was plain and blunt in the way men write when they believe they're writing for an audience of one. Stecker's message to Crane, dated February 28, 2018. "Reyes has filed a formal commendation for Carter. If it processes, it will require a review of the K-9 program's outcome documentation for the referenced period. That documentation contains operational details that are not suitable for IG-level review at this time. Recommend Carter's separation be advanced and structured to preclude ongoing access. Handle through the standard administrative channel. Do not flag to legal. Crane's response, March 2nd. Understood. Will coordinate with personnel. Commendation will be held at intake level pending administrative review. Review will not be completed within the statutory window, which was the mechanism. The commendation had been placed into a review queue that Crane controlled, and Crane had simply let the statutory processing window expire without acting on it, at which point the document moved from pending to lapsed in the system, and a lapsed commendation was, technically, a closed administrative matter. Nora had been removed from the program not because of a performance issue, not because of a compliance concern, not because of anything she'd done or failed to do. She'd been removed because Colonel Reyes had tried to put her name on a document that said this person did something exceptional, and that document, if it had entered the formal record, would have required reviewers to look at the program's outcome files for the period in question, and those outcome files apparently contained something that Stecker did not want reviewed. She sat with that for a moment. What was in the outcome files? She said. Marsh looked at her steadily. That's part of a separate inquiry, not directly relevant to your personnel case. But there is a separate inquiry. There is now, Marsh said. Yes. Nora looked at the documents. She thought about the 3 animals she'd worked with during that final period, K904, which was Sable, and 2 others, a shepherd mix named in the program records as K909 and a retriever cross designated K911. She thought about what those recoveries had looked like, what they'd required, what she'd documented in her own case notes that she'd submitted through standard channels and never received feedback on. She thought about whether there was anything in those notes that would have been inconvenient for someone. She couldn't identify what it might have been. Maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was that Stecker hadn't wanted anyone looking closely enough to find out, and the safest way to prevent that was to remove the person whose commendation would have opened the door. What happens to him? She said. Stecker is being notified today, Marsh said, through the appropriate command chain. The documentation from Crane's files, combined with Crane's cooperation, which was secured yesterday evening, creates a clear evidentiary record of a deliberate personnel action designed to circumvent both the commendation process and potential IG oversight. She paused. He will face a formal Inspector General investigation. Given his current rank and position, the process will involve the DoD's Senior Oversight Board. I cannot predict the outcome. I can tell you that the evidence is not ambiguous. He's still serving. For now, Marsh said, that is almost certainly not a permanent condition. The legal officer, who had said nothing so far, spoke for the first time. Ms. Carter, are you prepared to provide a formal statement specifically regarding the content of your case notes from the final operational period? That documentation would directly support the evidentiary record against both Crane and Stecker. Nora looked at him. He was young, mid-30s, with the careful posture of someone who had learned his profession in difficult rooms and taken it seriously. Yes, she said. I'll write whatever you need. The statement took 2.5 hours. It was not comfortable work, sitting at a table with a legal officer, going through the specific sequences of events with the rigor that formal documentation required, finding language for things she'd kept in a sealed interior space for 6 years and had not expected to have to articulate. She was not imprecise. She did not embellish, and she did not minimize. She described what she'd done, what she'd observed, what she'd recorded at the time, and what had happened to her in the months following, in the flat, accurate language of someone who has worked in clinical environments long enough to know that emotion and accuracy are not the same thing and that accuracy is what survives. When it was done, the legal officer reviewed it, made 2 minor clarification requests that she addressed, and then printed it and slid it across the table with a pen. She read it through once. It was accurate. She signed it. Marsh, who had been on and off her phone throughout the session, came back into the room as Nora finished. Stecker's command has been notified, she said. His advisory position has been placed on administrative hold pending the investigation. His access to personnel records in the Medical Training Command has been suspended. She paused. His attorney contacted my office at 11:47. Nora looked at her. That was fast. It was, Marsh said, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. When the evidentiary documentation is this complete, attorneys tend to move quickly. She went back to the ward at 1 p.m. The morning's work had not made the afternoon's work unnecessary. There were still patients, still medications, still assessments and wound checks and the thousand small tasks that made up the physical reality of care. And she did all of it with the same attention she always brought. And if the attention felt slightly different today, slightly less defended, slightly less like holding something back, that was a thing she noticed and set aside to examine later when she had the time. Garth in room 12 had received his discharge paperwork and was in a complex negotiation with Roland about the wound care protocol for home management, and Nora stopped in the doorway to watch it for a moment, Roland explaining the dressing schedule with patient precision, Garth pushing back on the frequency with the confidence of a man who had survived many things and trusted his own judgment more than was entirely warranted. "Every other day is fine," Garth was saying. "Every day for the first week," Roland said, with the tone of someone who had been through this particular exchange several times already today. "I've had worse than this." "I don't doubt it. Every day anyway." Garth caught Nora in the doorway and gave her the look of a man seeking an ally. "Tell him," he said. "Every day," she said. "He's right." Garth made a sound of deep democratic complaint and signed the form. She kept moving. At 3 o'clock, Halverson found her in the corridor outside the medication station. He was a man who ran large with small gestures, not cold, but economical, the kind of director who communicated authority by the simple fact of having it and didn't need to perform it. In the 6 weeks she'd been here, she'd spoken to him perhaps 4 times, all in passing. He stopped in front of her and he did something she hadn't seen him do in those 4 previous conversations. He looked like he was choosing his words. "I want to apologize," he said, "for the schedule change. I was made aware of it through the standard notification, and I didn't question it. I should have." She looked at him. He meant it. She could read the functional difference between apology as liability management and apology as actual acknowledgement, and this was the second kind. "You didn't know what you were looking at," she said. "No. But a nurse with a clean record and no documented performance issues doesn't get moved to overnight supply without someone asking why. I didn't ask." He held her gaze. "I'm asking now, retroactively and inadequately. I'm sorry." "Okay," she said. He nodded once, then, "Your position is fully restored to your standard assignment, effective immediately. Any documentation of the schedule change has been marked as administratively void." He paused. "There will also be a review of all schedule modifications made by Pollock over the past 18 months. If there are other staff members who were similarly managed, HR will be addressing those cases individually." She hadn't expected that last part. It was the right thing, and she hadn't expected it. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. At 4:30, Dario Vasquez walked through the front entrance of Hargrove Memorial Hospital. He was taller than she'd remembered, or maybe she'd just remembered him as he'd been at 28, and he was 40 now, with the kind of weathered that wasn't aging so much as density, like a person who'd been through enough that it had compressed into something solid. He had a travel bag over one shoulder, and the camera, a different one, digital now, but the same compulsive documentation impulse in the way he carried it, around his neck. He saw her from 20 feet away and stopped. She looked at him. He said, "You look exactly the same." "I really don't," she said. He crossed the distance, and they did the thing that people do when they haven't seen each other in 6 years, and the last time was complicated. An embrace that lasted slightly longer than a casual greeting and held the specific weight of, "I thought about whether I'd see you again, and now here we are." He pulled back and looked at her with the direct appraisal she remembered, the way he'd always looked at things he was trying to accurately assess. "Are you okay?" he said. "People keep asking me that," she said. "People who know you are going to keep asking it until you give them a real answer." She thought about it. The honest version, not the functional version, not the working on it, not the deflection. "I'm angry," she said. "I'm relieved. There's something that feels like grief for the 6 years, and I don't know what to do with that yet. And underneath all of it, there's something else that I don't have a word for, something that's been stuck for a long time and might be starting to move." Dario looked at her. "That's a real answer," he said. "Yeah," she said. "It is." Marcia's final briefing with Hargrove Memorial's senior staff happened at 5 o'clock that afternoon, a shorter session, 30 minutes, primarily to communicate the formal outcomes of the review and the institutional changes that would follow. Nora was present. Alderman was present. Halverson sat at the head of the table and took notes with the seriousness of a man who understood that the notes would matter. Marsh laid out the findings concisely. Mitchell Crane had been removed from his position pending formal disciplinary proceedings. Garrett Pollock's employment was under HR review with a strong preliminary finding of policy violation. Brigadier General Stecker was under active IG investigation at the DoD level. The suppressed commendation had been formally entered into Nora's personnel record, with a correction letter issued to the relevant military records archive. Then she said the next part. The Army Inspector General's office will be recommending to the appropriate command structure that a formal ceremony of recognition be held for the personnel affected by the administrative actions identified in this review. Specifically, those individuals whose commendations were suppressed or whose service records were altered to prevent accurate reflection of their contributions. She looked at Nora once, briefly, then back to the room. Ms. Carter is the primary subject of this review. She will be recognized first. The room was quiet. Alderman put his coffee cup down very carefully, as if doing it quietly was important. Halverson said, "On behalf of this facility, we would like to be part of that ceremony, if that's possible." Marsh looked at him. "It's possible," she said. The ceremony was 3 weeks later. It was held in the main conference center, not because it was the largest space, but because it was the space where things had been said publicly that had needed to be said, and there was something appropriate about returning to it for this. The room was full in a different way than it had been full for Marsh's briefing, fuller, warmer, with the specific energy of an event that people have come to voluntarily because they want to be present for it, rather than because they've been directed there. Dario was in the second row with his camera in his lap, not photographing yet, just holding it. Galt was beside him. They'd met in person for the first time 2 weeks ago, and had arrived at an easy companionship with the speed of people who'd been on the same side of something for a long time without being in the same room. Priya was in the front row, which she'd claimed early and would not have relinquished under any circumstances. Alderman was in uniform, which he hadn't worn since the first day, and Stern was beside him with the expression of someone who had been following this story from a position of incomplete information and was glad to finally have the context. Garth had asked to be there. He'd been discharged 3 days ago and had driven back for this, which was the kind of thing people did that Nora didn't quite know how to hold. Marsh was at the front. Beside her was Colonel Adela Reyes, who had flown in from her retirement in New Mexico, and who looked in person exactly as Nora had remembered: precise handshake, the habit of listening to the end of a sentence, a quality of directness that required no performance because it was simply how she was built. When Reyes saw Nora, she crossed the room without waiting for the program to start and took her by both hands. "I've been trying to get that paper to you for 6 years," she said. She said it quietly, for Nora alone, and her voice had something in it that wasn't quite apology because the fault wasn't hers, but was in the neighborhood of apology. The guilt of a person who did the right thing and then discovered it hadn't arrived. "I know," Nora said. "I know you tried. I should have pushed harder when I didn't see confirmation. You filed it through the correct channel. You had no reason to believe it would be intercepted." Reyes looked at her. Her eyes were bright in a way that wasn't performance, just the involuntary brightness of someone who has been carrying a thing and has finally put it down. "You were the best medical officer that program ever had," she said. "I wrote what was true." Nora pressed the older woman's hands once and let go, because she was going to lose her composure if the conversation continued in that direction, and she had decided she was going to get through this without losing her composure, not out of pride but out of the simple preference for choosing when and where. The ceremony itself took 50 minutes. Marsh spoke. Reyes spoke. Halverson spoke briefly and said the right things, and had clearly prepared them rather than improvising, which she respected. The commendation was read aloud. All of it, every word Reyes had written 6 years ago, read into a room full of people who were hearing it for the first time, and Nora stood at the front and listened to a description of herself and her work that the relevant institutions had decided she shouldn't have access to, and she found that she had things to feel about it that she hadn't anticipated. She'd thought she would feel vindicated. She did, but vindication was thinner than she'd expected. Less sustaining, more like a door finally opening than like anything beyond the doorway. What she hadn't expected was the grief. clean, specific grief for the version of herself at 32 who had signed those papers believing she had no alternative, who had walked out of that program not knowing that someone had tried to say this matters, what she did matters, and that the saying had been quietly swallowed. That person had deserved to know. She hadn't known. That was a loss, and it sat alongside everything else, and she let it sit there without trying to resolve it into something more comfortable. When it was her turn to speak, she did what she always did. She said what was accurate and left out what wasn't necessary. She said, "I'm not going to tell you this has been easy. 6 years of carrying something you're not allowed to name is its own specific kind of weight, and I don't think it's useful to pretend otherwise. What I'll say is that the people in this room, the ones who kept records, the ones who made calls, the ones who found a way to put a photograph in a dog's harness and trust that the right person would find it, those people did something that required sustained patience and a long view, and that's harder than most people understand." She paused. "I spent 6 years being quiet about a chapter of my life that I was told had to stay quiet. I'm done with that now. This work, the animals, the handlers, the recovery process, the specific combination of medical knowledge and relational patience that it requires. That work is real, and it mattered, and I did it, and it's in my record now, and that's where it should be." She looked at the room. "That's all I wanted," she said, "for it to be where it should be." Dario, in the second row, had his camera up now. She heard the shudder. After the ceremony, the room took on the quality of a gathering that doesn't want to end, people staying longer than they'd planned, conversations extending, the specific reluctance to conclude something that had been a long time arriving. Reyes stayed for an hour and spent most of it with Nora, talking about the program's animals, the specifics of the work, the outcomes that had never properly been written into anyone's history. It was the conversation they'd never been allowed to have, and it had the quality of something that had been under pressure for a long time releasing slowly, and it was good. Galt shook her hand and didn't say much, which was right. What needed to be said had already been said between them. Dario hung back until almost everyone else had gone. "What's next?" he said. He meant it practically. What was she going to do? Where was she going? What did the shape of the next chapter look like? But it landed on multiple levels simultaneously, and he knew it. "I'm staying," she said. "Halverson offered me a senior nursing role, trauma unit lead. I said I'd think about it." "Are you actually thinking about it, or have you already decided?" She looked at him. "I've already decided." He smiled. It was the smile she remembered from 2 a.m. in a facility in the Northwest, sitting on a concrete floor with animals who needed something specific from the people around them. The smile of a person who found genuinely funny the gap between how long things took and how obvious they were once they arrived. "Recon," he said. "Alderman is processing the placement paperwork," she said. "Stern signed off on his medical suitability yesterday. He'll transition to my address in about 2 weeks, once the protocol period is done." "You sure about that? He's a lot of dog." "I know what he is," she said. Dario nodded. Then he put the camera up and took one more photograph. Her in the empty room, the chairs still slightly disarranged from the gathering, the afternoon light coming through the windows at the angle it came in late November. And she was not smiling, but she was not guarded either, and whatever was in her face, she let him have it. 2 weeks later, Recon came home. Alderman drove him over on a Tuesday morning in a government vehicle with the back seat modified for transport, and he walked the dog up to Nora's front door on a standard lead and handed her the lead with the same lack of ceremony with which he'd handed her the loop in the intake room 4 weeks ago. And it was right that it happened that way, with no theater, just the simple transfer of a weight from one set of hands to another. Recon stood in her front doorway and scented the air and looked at the interior of the space, the furniture, the light, the smell of it, the specific configuration, with the assessing attention of an animal doing serious evaluative work. He was thorough about it. He took his time. Then he walked inside. He found the space she'd prepared for him, the padded platform in the corner of the main room near the window, positioned so he could see both the door and the exterior, and he walked around it twice and lay down and put his head on his paws and looked at her. She sat on the floor nearby, same as always, and waited for whatever he needed. After a while, he closed his eyes. She sat there in the quiet of her apartment in Dalton Springs, Wyoming, in November, with the afternoon light coming through the window, and she thought about what it meant to be a person who contains a history that the world spent 6 years pretending didn't exist, And then one Tuesday morning, the world admitted it was wrong. She thought about Mitchell Crane, who had been formally notified of his pending discharge from Healthcare Administration. She thought about Garrett Pollock, whose employment review had concluded with a finding of sustained behavioral misconduct spanning 4 years. Not just her schedule change, but a pattern of suppression, negative evaluations weaponized against staff members he'd identified as threats, documentation manipulated to protect his position. The HR finding had been referred to the state licensing board. It would follow him. She thought about Brigadier General Stecker in Virginia, whose advisory position had been revoked pending the IG investigation, whose attorney had begun the quiet, humiliating work of negotiating consequences for a man who had believed his rank made him immune to them. That investigation would take months. It would conclude the way investigations concluded when the documentation was complete and the witnesses were willing and the institution doing the investigating had run out of reasons to look away. She wouldn't be there for the conclusion. She didn't need to be. The work of accountability didn't require her attendance. It only required that she'd told the truth, and she had. Ricon's breathing deepened into sleep. His body, which had been tense for weeks in the way all bodies are tense when the environment is unpredictable, had gone heavy and loose the way it only went when something had finally been resolved at a level below conscious thought. She looked at him. She thought about a thing she'd never been able to articulate to anyone in 6 years of civilian life, the thing that had made the sealed chapter feel like such a specific loss. The work she'd done in that program had not been ordinary nursing, not ordinary animal care. It had been something at the intersection of the two, requiring a quality of attention that was less clinical than relational. The practice of being present with a living creature that had been damaged by its experience in ways that medication couldn't reach, and offering it something steady and consistent until the creature's own systems could find their way back to function. It was slow work. It was unremarkable-looking work, most of it. It was not the kind of work that telegraphed its importance. That was, in some ways, the thing that had made it so easy to erase. Quiet work, done without an audience, in rooms that no one official was paying attention to. But the animals remembered it. They carried the record of it in their behavior, their capacity to trust, the way they walked into rooms that used to terrify them. The record couldn't be sealed because it lived in something that didn't have a record system and didn't know what classification meant. Ricon's ear twitched in his sleep. She put her hand on his back. She was going to keep doing this work, formally now, on record, with her full history attached to her name the way it should have been attached for 6 years. Halverson's offer was on the table, and she would take it, but she was also going to talk to Marsh about the other 10 people in that file, about what they needed, about whether there was a way to connect the program's former personnel to the institutional recognition that had been withheld from them. It was not her job to do that. She was going to do some version of it anyway, because she had the standing now, and the contacts, and the specific knowledge of what it cost to carry an unacknowledged history, and those resources, once you had them, created their own kind of obligation. The afternoon light moved across the floor. She thought finally about the things she'd said at the ceremony. I just wanted it to be where it should be. And she recognized that she'd meant it, and that it was also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she had wanted to be seen accurately for a long time, and had learned to need that less, and had been wrong to learn to need it less, because needing to be accurately seen is not weakness and not ego. It is the basic expectation of a person who has done real work in a real world and would like the record to reflect that the work happened. Some people spend their entire lives waiting for that acknowledgement, and it never comes. She was sitting in a room with a sleeping dog and a commendation in her personnel file in a job she was going to be good at, and it had come. Not easily, not without cost, not without 6 years of a smaller life built around a sealed chapter, but it had come, and it was real, and it was hers. The thing about quiet strength, the actual thing, not the version people say when they mean someone who suffers without complaint, is that it isn't about silence. It isn't about enduring. It's about continuing to do the real work when the recognition isn't there, when the institution isn't watching, when the only evidence that it matters is the evidence inside the room. The animal that was unreachable and then wasn't, the patient whose vitals stabilized during your shift, the colleague you caught before the error reached the patient, the record you kept because someone would eventually need it to be there. The work, sustained over time, in rooms no one is paying attention to. That is the work that holds things together. That is always the work that holds things together. The people doing it quietly, without an audience, without a commendation in their file or a ceremony in a conference room, they are the reason the more visible things are possible at all. And most of them will never be in a room like the one she was in 3 weeks ago. Most of them will do the work and not be seen doing it, and the world will continue to run on what they built without knowing their names. She knew that. She had been one of them for 6 years, and she would carry that knowledge differently now. Not as injury, but as understanding. As the specific literacy of a person who has been on both sides of visibility and knows what each one costs and what each one asks. Recon shifted in his sleep. His paw moved once, the small running motion of a dog dreaming, and then stilled. She kept her hand on his back. Outside, the November afternoon was doing what Wyoming afternoons did, going toward dark earlier than felt fair, the sky moving through the sequence of grays that ended in the particular darkness of a rural November night, clear and deep and full of more stars than people who'd lived in cities could quite believe. She was going to be okay. Not perfectly. Not without the grief she'd named to Dario, which would take longer to process than a ceremony and a document. Not without the nights that still sometimes ended at 4 a.m. with her staring at a ceiling. But okay in the real sense. The sense that meant functional and purposeful and connected to work that was worth doing, with a record that now reflected who she actually was and what she had actually done. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, most of what anyone could reasonably ask for, and considerably more than she'd had 6 weeks ago when she'd walked into a hospital in a town she barely knew and sat on a concrete floor with a dog that everyone else had given up on and waited. She was good at waiting. She was better now at knowing what she was waiting for. After the ceremony, the room took on the quality of a gathering that doesn't want to end. People staying longer than they'd planned, conversations extending, the specific reluctance to conclude something that had been a long time arriving. Reyes stayed for an hour and spent most of it with Nora, talking about the program's animals, the specifics of the work, the outcomes that had never properly been written into anyone's history. It was the conversation they'd never been allowed to have, and it had the quality of something that had been under pressure for a long time releasing slowly, and it was good. Galt shook her hand and didn't say much, which was right. What needed to be said had already been said between them. Dario hung back until almost everyone else had gone. "What's next?" he said. He meant it practically. What was she going to do? Where was she going? What did the shape of the next chapter look like? But it landed on multiple levels simultaneously, and he knew it. "I'm staying," she said. "Halverson offered me a senior nursing role, trauma unit lead. I said I'd think about it." "Are you actually thinking about it, or have you already decided?" She looked at him. "I've already decided." He smiled. It was the smile she remembered from 2 a.m. in a facility in the Northwest, sitting on a concrete floor with animals who needed something specific from the people around them. The smile of a person who found genuinely funny the gap between how long things took and how obvious they were once they arrived. "Recon," he said. "Alderman is processing the placement paperwork," she said. "Stern signed off on his medical suitability yesterday. He'll transition to my address in about 2 weeks, once the protocol period is done." "You sure about that? He's a lot of dog." "I know what he is," she said. Dario nodded. Then he put the camera up and took one more photograph. Her in the empty room, the chairs still slightly disarranged from the gathering, the afternoon light coming through the windows at the angle it came in late November. And she was not smiling, but she was not guarded either, and whatever was in her face, she let him have it. 2 weeks later, Recon came home. Alderman drove him over on a Tuesday morning in a government vehicle with the back seat modified for transport, and he walked the dog up to Nora's front door on a standard lead and handed her the lead with the same lack of ceremony with which he'd handed her the loop in the intake room 4 weeks ago. And it was right that it happened that way. With no theater, just the simple transfer of a weight from one set of hands to another. Recon stood in her front doorway and scented the air and looked at the interior of the space, the furniture, the light, the smell of it, the specific configuration, with the assessing attention of an animal doing serious evaluative work. He was thorough about it. He took his time. Then he walked inside. He found the space she'd prepared for him. The padded platform in the corner of the main room near the window, positioned so he could see both the door and the exterior. And he walked around it twice and lay down and put his head on his paws and looked at her. She sat on the floor nearby, same as always, and waited for whatever he needed. After a while, he closed his eyes. She sat there in the quiet of her apartment in Dalton Springs, Wyoming, in November, with the afternoon light coming through the window, and she thought about what it meant to be a person who contains a history that the world spent 6 years pretending didn't exist. And then one Tuesday morning, the world admitted it was wrong. She thought about Mitchell Crane, who had been formally notified of his pending discharge from Healthcare Administration. She thought about Garrett Pollock, whose employment review had concluded with a finding of sustained behavioral misconduct spanning 4 years. Not just her schedule change, but a pattern of suppression, negative evaluations weaponized against staff members he'd identified as threats, documentation manipulated to protect his position. The HR finding had been referred to the state licensing board. It would follow him. She thought about Brigadier General Stecker in Virginia, whose advisory position had been revoked pending the IG investigation, whose attorney had begun the quiet, humiliating work of negotiating consequences for a man who had believed his rank made him immune to them. That investigation would take months. It would conclude the way investigations concluded when the documentation was complete and the witnesses were willing and the institution doing the investigating had run out of reasons to look away. She wouldn't be there for the conclusion. She didn't need to be. The work of accountability didn't require her attendance. It only required that she'd told the truth, and she had. Recon's breathing deepened into sleep. His body, which had been tense for weeks in the way all bodies are tense when the environment is unpredictable, had gone heavy and loose the way it only went when something had finally been resolved at a level below conscious thought. She looked at him. She thought about a thing she'd never been able to articulate to anyone in 6 years of civilian life, the thing that had made the sealed chapter feel like such a specific loss. The work she'd done in that program had not been ordinary nursing, not ordinary animal care. It had been something at the intersection of the two, requiring a quality of attention that was less clinical than relational. The practice of being present with a living creature that had been damaged by its experience in ways that medication couldn't reach, and offering it something steady and consistent until the creature's own systems could find their way back to function. It was slow work. It was unremarkable-looking work, most of it. It was not the kind of work that telegraphed its importance. That was in some ways the thing that had made it so easy to erase. Quiet work, done without an audience, in rooms that no one official was paying attention to. But the animals remembered it. They carried the record of it in their behavior, their capacity to trust, the way they walked into rooms that used to terrify them. The record couldn't be sealed because it lived in something that didn't have a record system and didn't know what classification meant. Recon's ear twitched in his sleep. She put her hand on his back. She was going to keep doing this work, formally now, on record, with her full history attached to her name the way it should have been attached for 6 years. Halverson's offer was on the table, and she would take it, but she was also going to talk to Marsh about the other 10 people in that file, about what they needed, about whether there was a way to connect the program's former personnel to the institutional recognition that had been withheld from them. It was not her job to do that. She was going to do some version of it anyway, because she had the standing now and the contacts and the specific knowledge of what it cost to carry an unacknowledged history, and those resources, once you had them, created their own kind of obligation. The afternoon light moved across the floor. She thought finally about the things she'd said at the ceremony. I just wanted it to be where it should be. And she recognized that she'd meant it, and that it was also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she had wanted to be seen accurately for a long time, and had learned to need that less, and had been wrong to learn to need it less, because needing to be accurately seen is not weakness and not ego. It is the basic expectation of a person who has done real work in a real world and would like the record to reflect that the work happened. Some people spend their entire lives waiting for that acknowledgement, and it never comes. She was sitting in a room with a sleeping dog and a commendation in her personnel file in a job she was going to be good at, and it had come. Not easily, not without cost, not without 6 years of a smaller life built around a sealed chapter. But it had come, and it was real, and it was hers. The thing about quiet strength, the actual thing, not the version people say when they mean someone who suffers without complaint, is that it isn't about silence. It isn't about enduring. It's about continuing to do the real work when the recognition isn't there, when the institution isn't watching, when the only evidence that it matters is the evidence inside the room. The animal that was unreachable and then wasn't, the patient whose vitals stabilized during your shift, the colleague you caught before the error reached the patient, The record you kept because someone would eventually need it to be there. The work, sustained over time, in rooms no one is paying attention to. That is the work that holds things together. That is always the work that holds things together. The people doing it quietly, without an audience, without a commendation in their file or a ceremony in a conference room, they are the reason the more visible things are possible at all. And most of them will never be in a room like the one she was in 3 weeks ago. Most of them will do the work and not be seen doing it, and the world will continue to run on what they built without knowing their names. She knew that. She had been one of them for 6 years, and she would carry that knowledge differently now. Not as injury, but as understanding. As the specific literacy of a person who has been on both sides of visibility and knows what each one costs and what each one asks. Recon shifted in his sleep. His paw moved once, the small running motion of a dog dreaming, and then stilled. She kept her hand on his back. Outside, the November afternoon was doing what Wyoming afternoons did, going toward dark earlier than felt fair, the sky moving through the sequence of grays that ended in the particular darkness of a rural November night, clear and deep, and full of more stars than people who'd lived in cities could quite believe. She was going to be okay. Not perfectly. Not without the grief she'd named to Dario, which would take longer to process than a ceremony and a document. Not without the nights that still sometimes ended at 4 a.m. with her staring at a ceiling. But okay in the real sense. The sense that meant functional and purposeful and connected to work that was worth doing, with a record that now reflected who she actually was and what she had actually done. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, most of what anyone could reasonably ask for, and considerably more than she'd had 6 weeks ago when she'd walked into a hospital in a town she barely knew and sat on a concrete floor with a dog that everyone else had given up on, and waited. She was good at waiting. She was better, now, at knowing what